9, 12, 10, 28, 2, 23.
This is Deep State Radio.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm Marc and this is DSR's Above Average Intelligence Show. Today, I'm very happy to welcome as my guest, Ilana Berry, also known, if you are a aficionado of bookstores or espionage books, as I.S. Berry, the author of a fantastic book, which I absolutely loved, The Peacock and the Sparrow. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But Ilana is someone who I met in person, I don't know, maybe recently, a couple months ago, but I've wanted to have on the podcast for some time. I'm thrilled, Ilana, that you've agreed to come on. So much to talk to you about, not only about your book, but also about one of my favorite things about what it's like being a case officer overseas, particularly in times of incredible change, is what I think we're seeing in Syria today. So, Ilana, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be on.
So what I always do in these as well, it's super informal, as we just talked about in our kind of virtual green room, but a little bit of background on you. Ilana spent 6 years as an operations officer for the CIA, serving in wartime Baghdad and elsewhere. Ilana lived and worked throughout Europe and the Middle East, including 2 years in Bahrain during the Arab Spring. Aha, this is my interest first today. She's a graduate of the University of Virginia School of Law and Haverford College, raised in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. She lives in Virginia with her husband and son. And again, the author of The Peacock and the Sparrow, which has won like every possible award known to humankind. And we're definitely going to talk about the book because I absolutely loved it. I was actually sending you direct DMs as I was reading this.
Thank you.
And you were very clever because you said, just wait till the end, just wait to the end. And the end, of course, blew my mind. But incredibly well-received book. And so we'll get to that in a second. But I just want to kind of start off, when I hit you up the other day and asked you to come on, I said, I want to talk about Syria. You mentioned to me you're not a Syria expert.
Correct.
But that to me doesn't matter because you are an expert on kind of human behavior, what a revolution looks like. You served and then wrote about the Arab Spring in Bahrain. Yeah. So talk a little bit about that. I guess first, your experience, and I'll give some comments what I think is going on with Syria, but talk about what that's like to be someone who witnesses history, because that's so much why I wanted you to be on today.
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting. So I was in Bahrain for 2 years during the Arab Spring. It had already gone underway when I was there. But it's funny because one of the things that I get from reader reviewers are that some people say the ending, I don't want to give away the ending, but a lot happens at the end and it's sort of world changing and governments collapse. And people say, oh, that's unrealistic. That doesn't happen. And I always say that's exactly what happens. And I think we've seen that time and again. And we saw it in Afghanistan, and we just saw it in Syria. And as I said, when I was in Bahrain, it was. I got there in early 2012 and left about 2 years later. So the Arab Spring had been going on for a little less than a year. So it hadn't just started. But one of the things that the fall of Assad brought to my mind was actually my time in Baghdad. I was there fall 2004 to fall 2005. And it was weird because watching Syria fall felt like the elections in January 2005, which were the first democratic elections in Iraq. And I remember those vividly. And it was a feeling of jubilation and a feeling like a new page was being turned. And I remember because we were, that was sort of the apex of the insurgency when I was there. And we were mortared and rocketed every day. I know you were in Baghdad as well, Marc, right?
Yeah, I was there. I was there. I lived with the Kurds before the war up in the north and then went in for the infill. And I left in May of 2003.
Okay.
At a time where there was a lot of hope.
Right. Yeah. And when I got there was not a lot of hope. I mean, the insurgency was in full swing. We weren't close to finding Zarqawi. And then there was this moment in January 2005 during the elections where they were incredibly peaceful elections. It was huge turnout. And for like a month after that, we had no attacks on the green zone. And it was the most resounding blow to terrorism that I witnessed when I was there, was just this voting, like, democracy at work. And it didn't last. There was this kind of vacuum, and unfortunately we didn't do any. There are a lot of reasons I think that it didn't succeed, the government, including that the Sunni had been disenfranchised and they didn't really participate that much in the election. So I think it wasn't seen as a government of the people. But there was this moment of hope, I remember, in January 2005, and when Syria, when Assad fell, I feel like that it brought me back to that moment.
So it's interesting you say that. One of the things that has bothered me is that there's almost this because of the events, what happened in Syria and Libya, maybe in some ways Afghanistan too. When there's change like this, there's this kind of reflexive view amongst kind of the foreign policy chattering classes, which I guess we can consider ourselves sort of members of the blob. But that somehow there's some negativity involved. And what I've been trying to tell people, it's not working, but as I go on MSNBC every couple of days, is there is so much cynicism about what's happened with the Arab Spring, but the couple things. One is, let's give the Syrian people time to actually have some joy.
Yes.
That having lived there and seen the true nature of such a repressive regime, the disappointment of the Syrian civil war, which in many ways because Assad was on the ropes and some bad policy decisions, I think, saved him by, frankly, the United States inviting in Russia and others. But ultimately, we didn't think this day would happen. So let the Syrians have some joy now, and take a look. Bashar al-Assad killed 500,000 people. There's tens of thousands, maybe even more, languishing in prisons, and those scenes of camera crews going into these prisons is quite dramatic. So give them some hope. But I guess one of the things that I wanted to ask you is, so let's learn from history. So instead of just reflexively saying, "Oh, this is all going to turn to shit," which is what everybody, all the commentators on TV who know nothing on the Middle East, of course, are saying. I think a smarter thing would be like, okay, what did we do incorrectly? We as in the United States and the international community, how do we not make those same mistakes in Syria?
Yeah.
Because I think it's kind of intellectually lazy sometimes to say, things might go south. Well, they may, but isn't it better to say, okay, how can we do better?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think, again, compared to Iraq, one of the big reasons I think Iraq failed at that juncture was we were still involved. And I think, we don't need to impose our own version of what kind of government we want. So I think that would maybe be lesson one. Number two, that my big take from the Arab Spring is that it's not going to look like what you think it looks like. We can't impose our Western notions of democracy. And at this point in our own democracy, I don't know that we even have the moral right to do that. But I just think that, the Arab Spring, we all had high hopes and it was going to be a watershed moment for democracy. And it turned out not to be that way. And it was overall a failure, except in Tunisia a little bit. And Bahrain was a failure. But, what I tried to bring out in my book is that there is no clear, perfect option in Bahrain. Right. You have this kind of enlightened but repressive monarchy that's supported by Saudi Arabia. And then you have the opposition, which has absolutely valid democratic, grievances against the monarchy, but has received support from Iran. I think it's pretty well documented. And we have allied with the Bahraini government. We have a naval base there, and they're a bulwark against Iran. So I think, I think that we have to modify our expectations that it doesn't have to be a perfect government. And I guess I would say too, that I think what I saw in Bahrain was, I feel like the opposition, came time and again to the monarchy with demands, and some of them were really reasonable and moderate. And the monarchy time and again promised they would meet these demands and then reneged. And I wonder if, if the Arab Spring would have ended kind of peacefully and when it's still simmering, if the monarchy had just met them halfway, and that didn't happen in Bahrain. And so I'm saying it doesn't have to be a perfect option. And it wouldn't, I don't even think the opposition there wouldn't even have to necessarily be a democratically elected government in Bahrain for there to be a more harmonious government. So I think that maybe that's a good lens to look at Syria, that it doesn't have to be perfect. And that I think one of the key things is, I was listening to an analysis and they were saying that it's really going to be key that Jelani reaches out to these different groups, that it's not going to be a democracy, but as long as he's incorporating these different groups, that would make a difference.
So I just want to kind of relay a story. He'll probably be mad at me, but this is, I'm not sure he's listening to the podcast, but I remember sitting with Bill Burns maybe a year or two ago, and we were talking about some other events that had occurred. But I said, I kind of gave him my 2 cents, whether it's worth it or not, about what CIA became really good at. And I said, hey, I worked counterterrorism operations for my career, and we got really good at killing people. And he kind of looked at me, and I said, I'm saying this as someone who was involved in this, like the manhunting, the find, fix, and finish mission. There's nobody better on the planet. Maybe the Israelis wrote the first book, but then we wrote the next, 4 or 5 editions. But what we're terrible at, and I offered this, and he didn't say anything, but I said we're terrible at assessing regime stability, and the Arab Spring was a gigantic intelligence failure in my view, because we never get this right, and so so that's not and I know it's hard assessing autocratic regimes, but I always kind of look back to that conversation because I think that U.S. and Israeli intelligence, Arab intelligence services missed what just happened in Damascus as well. Perhaps 100%. The Turks are the only ones who got it right. But even then, I think HTS's kind of blitzkrieg in the north turned into this catastrophic success. And then the regime falls. But a couple of things that you said I think that is important. I think we do have to engage with HTS. I saw the Secretary of Blinken on Saturday saying that we would. I called for that. I mentioned this morning, and again, if anyone's watching at 5:40 a.m., I said my prediction was right last week. But we need to engage because things like the counter-ISIS mission,
100%,
like loose chemical weapons, like Austin Tice, the fate of a U.S. journalist who's missing, and of course, trying to shape some kind of government that is inclusive and respects minorities and Christians, etc. So I think that's the right thing. One of the things that you probably are the same at this. I don't reach back into our old building. I don't want to put my old friends at risk by talking to them on stuff. But I wouldn't be surprised if our old outfit was actually front and center in some of the contacts with HTS. Which is again the right thing to do. But let's go back to I guess your experiences in Iraq and Bahrain, but also from you wrote in your book. We'll talk about your book in a second, but your role as a case officer, again, one of the things I think people don't, and what I try to tell students sometimes when I go talk at colleges, is that you have the opportunity to really witness history. Because and it's because our dealing with assets right now. So put yourself in the position. Let's say you were in some kind of role now, helping run Syria operations. What's it like talking to a Syrian asset right now? How do you motivate them? Incredible change going on.
Oh God,
that's the kind of stuff, by the way, that I miss more than our former colleagues. I love talking to you, but I actually miss the assets. I miss our agents, those who really risk their life for us.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good question, and I found in Iraq. I mean, oddly enough, I feel like a lot of my sources were ideologically motivated. They always kind of at the farm. I don't know. I left the farm feeling like the number one cause was money or personal grievance. And I felt like, oddly enough, it was such a weighty time when I was there. I mean, there was so much change and the stakes were so high, and there was just this huge conflagration, sweeping the country, and people really, the Iraqis I talked to really wanted to make a difference. I mean, they were risking their lives. And when I was there, we had a lot of operational limitations because of the security situation. So we mostly were inside the green zone, and sources would walk into the green zone. Occasionally we would go out and pick up a source and into the red zone and bring them back in. But because of that, because Iraqis had to walk into the green zone, and that was a big risk for them. And so I think they had to, they weren't getting paid all that much. So I think they really they just believed in it. So
it was it was ideology. So if just for kind of some of the listeners out there, I go back to some of the things we were taught. How do you assess an asset candidate's motivations? And it's that old acronym MICE, which is money, ideology, coercion, and ego. And again, that's the process of how a CIA case officer will kind of go down the path for recruiting an asset. But it was really interesting what you just said there, because you found ideology was front and center in some of the Iraqi sources. What else in your? I mean, what were, looking back on your career? What is let's see, what is the easiest asset to handle in terms of that acronym, and then the most challenging?
Well, first of all, I didn't have a long career, I should say that, so I don't have a lot of data points. But I would say the most challenging. Well, I mean, ideological was good, because I think it doesn't really matter who you are as a person. And I say that, me as a case officer, and I say that because I'm a woman. And in the Middle East, it wasn't always easy dealing with men. And some of them didn't want to deal with me. I'm comparing like two different sources in my mind. Like, one was really ideologically committed, didn't care if it was me or my male colleague. The other, not so much. I mean, he was, and I think the other one had money as part of his motivation, and I think ego as well. He was like a former Ba'athist type, and felt irrelevant in this new world, and wanted to maintain his relevance. And he was a real chauvinist, and he was hard to deal with. And it didn't matter how good a case officer I was; he just didn't want to deal with women. So that was tough.
I think, thinking back, that I thought those who were motivated by money were the easiest to handle, because that was, money was just kind of the driving force. The most challenging, but also the most interesting, was ego.
Yeah.
That to me was fascinating, because there's such a way you can, manipulate, unfortunate is the word we use, someone not appreciated in their system for whatever reason, yet we can do things such as, give them some kind of, pseudo fake promotion, or say that they've received a medal or something like that. But oftentimes, to me, ego is a really powerful, motivating factor. But I want to dive into one thing with you on this, because, when I go around, I talk to college kids. Everyone wants to take a class on cyber. Is that going to help me build my resume to get into the CIA? And I say, if you like it, it'll help you, just because it's interesting.
A class on
cyber, something like cyber. But I think the best preparation for a case officer would be, get a psychology degree. Yeah. Take a Psych 101 class, because agent handling, or agent running, as the Brits like to say, is Psych 501.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like, I've always maintained that introverts make good case officers, because they listen. And I think a lot of people go into the profession thinking that it's all about talking and it's all about persuading people. But I think beneath that is you listen and you hear what they're saying before you say anything.
Well, I had a boss who once said that to me. If you're talking, you ain't listening. And I remember again, thinking back on just some really incredible cases that I had nothing to do with. Where there was, I remember at one point, I obviously can't say where, but someone in essence volunteered to us, but they did so after observing one of our most introverted case officers on the diplomatic circuit. And afterwards, and kind of as the process of assessment of this individual, he actually said, well, I looked around, and he said, there were all these other clowns, pointing to me and others, who were out, running around doing, shots of vodka with the Russians and acting like jerks and idiots, which this is actually humbling for me. And they're like, well, they're clearly CIA officers, but that person who sits on the side at the dip reception goes to every reception. But I know what, that person's going to keep me alive.
Oh,
And I thought that was such a great,
yeah,
I learned so much, from kind of humbling experiences like that. And
yeah,
they're kind of right when they say that. And again, is when I love the idea of us passing the torch to the next generation. And so when I do this, I do tell people you don't have to be an extrovert, you don't have to
oh,
be a
for
car
sure,
salesman, type A personality. Um,
for sure.
and so the introverts really can have tremendous success. And by the way, that case officer who, so it was not really, it was a volunteer, not a walk-in, but he chose the officer based on his demeanor. He
Interesting.
deserves, or she, whoever it was, deserves all the credit
Yeah,
for that recruitment.
yeah, interesting. Yeah, and I do think women are really good in that regard. I feel like women are good listeners
Yeah.
naturally.
So, I mean, in every posting that I had, and this is a very unscientific survey, but the most sensitive cases, and this is in the Middle East, in all my tours, the most sensitive cases were always handled by female case
Hmm.
officers, just period,
Yeah,
hands down.
yeah,
And I kind of thought about that after. My wife was a case officer as well, and we kind of thought about that a lot afterwards. I don't think that's an accident, to be honest.
yeah. I agree. Yeah.
So let me ask you, because we're going to get to your book in a sec, but I do, you said you worked for 6 years as an operations officer. You've had this incredible kind of career change to best-selling author. But why did you leave? What was the impetus? Because it's not, one of the things that I saw. I've served for 26 years, but at the end of my career, I saw people starting to leave
Yeah.
at that 5 or 6 year point. It's, some would say, well, I had crappy management. Probably true. Others would say, look, it's a different generation. When I joined, it's like the Roach Motel, you never leave.
Uh-huh.
But so why was it? What was it that
Yeah.
um,
It was
that had?
it was a combination of factors. I mean, so for one thing, I think I saw the agency not at the greatest time, to be honest. It was not, I joined not long after 9/11, and it was very much in transition. It was kind of chaotic. I didn't have a great experience in Baghdad, and I had, I'm sure, some form of PTSD when I got back, and I didn't feel like the agency, as you probably know, I mean, they didn't have anything to address it.
Right.
And you couldn't even it wasn't even really defined at the time, but you couldn't see a counselor because that was like a liability. So it was not a great experience. And, also, I felt like the job of a case officer was never an easy fit for me, to be honest. And I admire people who do it. I think I'm incredibly proud of my service. But it was not easy for me. I mean, as you said, you're manipulating people, and I never, even in training, I think even at the farm, it was never comfortable for me. So I come from the world of analysis. I had worked as an intelligence analyst for Department of Defense before working for the CIA, and I really loved that job. And that seemed like a better fit to me, a more intellectual sort of approach to operations instead of as hands-on. So there was that. Those were two of the reasons, and the third was, to be blunt, I didn't feel like I was treated really all that well as a woman. I did feel like at the time the agency had a lot of progress to make in how it treated women. And this was before the Me Too movement. There weren't many women in leadership positions. So those were the three reasons, I'd say.
So, and I think I've had multiple guests come on the podcast over the last year for sure, who talked about the various, sexual harassment issues, scandals that the agency is facing. And I think that's something that certainly has to be taken very seriously. I mean, there's an incredible kind of notion that I think that there's some truth to things that, in my time, I thought I saw things change.
Mm-hmm.
But then I think people rested on their laurels too much. And one of the things, as I left, I started healing much more that the sexual harassment issues, and even just kind of some of the misogyny and the chauvinism got pushed under the surface a little bit. It wasn't open and brazen, like I saw it. But it still exists. And one of the things that I really have argued for, again, this is almost like, what's the best athlete approach? in the Middle East.
Yeah.
The best athlete approach is you need a diverse officer cadre,
Yeah.
including female case officers who, frankly, can go out in the street and disappear much more easily than men. So it's got to be a place that's safe for females to operate. And Bill Burns has said all the right things, but again, some of the data, obviously the scandals show that there's a long way to go on that.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, I had come from the world of the military. I worked for Department of Defense as an intelligence analyst, and I worked overseas, and it was almost all active duty. I was one of only a handful of civilians. And oddly enough, so the ratio, there were fewer women in my DoD job than there were as in the DO and the Director of Operations, which is also skews male, but it was even more so at DoD. And I never felt like a second-class citizen working for the military. And it was interesting to me because it was even more heavily male. And I think, and it's not to say, of course, there's harassment in the military, et cetera. But the military really had accountability and culture transparency down when I was there. From day one, they would tell you what sexual harassment was and what the consequences were. And when I joined the agency in 2002, there was none of that. There was not even a mention of sexual harassment. That said, I do think it has changed, even radically in some ways. And one of the highlights of my publishing journey has been the agency, the creative writing group, Invisible Ink, invited me to come in and speak. And it was the first time I'd been back in like 15 years. And it was very weird and scary. And I didn't, because I hadn't had the greatest experience at the agency, I was nervous, and I was like, I'm not the poster child. Are you sure you want me to come? And what was so wonderful and heartening to me was I said, I didn't have a great experience in Baghdad, and they ended up filming. They actually came to my house and filmed me for an internal program they were doing. But they said, we're not the same agency we were. We're self-critical. We're more introspective. Say what you want. We want you to be authentic. That's what we're all about. And that impressed me so much. I was like, this is the agency I wanted when I was there.
I hope that agency continues on.
Me too.
During this next administration. Let's leave it at that. This is the point in the podcast where we have to say goodbye to our guests who are not yet subscribers. If you want to listen to the rest of the podcast and all of our other shows in full, just go to the dsrnetwork.com and click on membership. It's only $7 a month, and it brings you a lot of great bonus content. So if you're not a subscriber, we hope you will be one soon. And if you are one, stand by. We'll be right back with Ilana, because we're going to jump into a whole bunch of stuff on, again, this tremendous book that she has written, continues to be a bestseller.